All right, welcome. So glad to have you all joining with us today, and so excited to be having session number 2 of our 3-part series, Meeting at the Crossroads of Grief and Trauma Awareness, a psychosocial spiritual approach for service providers in Mi'kma'ki. And I am excited to begin with you all. I want to invite you to join with us in our land acknowledgement. So please use the chat to introduce yourself and acknowledge the land where you are located. So if you're not familiar with the Mi'kmaq or Indigenous name for the territory where you are located, I invite you to Google it so that you can join with us in our land acknowledgement. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from Unama'ki, which is in Mi'kma'ki, and indeed the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers is in Mi'kma'ki. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers joins our members and our communities in the necessary labor of reconciliation. We are grateful to live and work together as treaty people in Mi'kma'ki. Let us take this moment for gratitude. Gratitude for this beautiful land, for the amazingly wise and brave Mi'kmaq leaders and communities who have cared for this land and who continue to care for and advocate for it. Please think of the lands, territories, and Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live within these lands, and how each of us, individually and as a collective body of social workers, can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. We are all treaty peoples. Walalu. And I invite us to take a few moments for deep breath as we pause in gratitude and reflection. Let us express, feel deep gratitude for all of the wise elders and Ilmu community leaders who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this land. May we join them in this work. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our minds and bodies with harmful energy. Let us take this moment to affirm our commitment to join in the important work of decolonization has affected so many. Let us take this moment to commit to justice and healing, for colonization is at the root of so much genocide, racism, queerphobia, and injustice here and across the planet. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all human beings as an expression of our gratitude, as well as an expression of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we all must begin to learn and honor. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. And with that, I'm going to introduce Kristen now to say a few words of welcome.
Good morning, and thank you so much from areas all across Nova Scotia. I see there's participants as far as South Africa. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad that you're tuning in for the second installment of this phenomenal opportunity for us to expand our practice and our own place within it. My name is Kristen Anderson. I am the Regional Coordinator for SchoolsPlus for the Western region. And with that, I'm going to introduce Tracy Shea, who was unable to be with us last week, but is our phenomenal support in the Northern region. So Tracy, if you could introduce yourself, then I will introduce Serena and we will get on our way this morning.
Thanks so much, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tracy Shea, and I'm the Coordinator of Integrated Services with the SchoolsPlus team, and I cover the Northern region. And I have been on a journey around grief work in the Northern region now for about 8 years with Serena. And as we continue on this journey, it's awesome to see so many folks here again today. It just reaffirms the need for the work that we're doing and the importance of the work that we're doing. So welcome, everyone. And I look forward to continuing on this journey with you all.
Thanks, Tracy. And with that, I will introduce the phenomenal Serena Lewis, who is again joining us today to expand our practice, our place within it, and give us an opportunity to reflect on how this topic sits with so many of us as we move forward in our own practice and in our supportive communities. So an award-winning social worker. She is has been a consultant, a social worker, and an educator committed to the values of social change. A clinician who specializes in the field of dying, death, and grief. She has mentored, educated, and case consulted with teams locally, provincially, and nationally. A facilitator, a committee participant on national groups. She has elevated the necessity for social justice at the end of life and around exploring our own place within grief and loss. So with that, Serena, I'm going to pass it over to you to start our journey again this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. And I just want to have, again, a huge shout out to all of the teams that are helping to make this possible. I know everyone is, we were talking about the time of year and all kinds of intersecting ways of how people are doing these days. So I want to thank Kristen and Tracy and Jolynn and the entire team of SchoolsPlus, Danielle. And who am I missing, Kristen? I know I've missed one name. Crystal?
Melody.
Melody, thank you. So the SchoolsPlus team, again, the generous contribution of the Mental Health Foundation and Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, Rebecca and behind the scenes here. So this is, again, a collaborative approach. And also want to acknowledge, I spent some time, thanks to Rebecca, she actually captured some of the comments last week so I could sit down and read. And what I thought is we've really created a bit of a peer-led dialogue in the best way that we can via this whole Zoom link, but here we go. So again, I just encourage all of you, the participation last week was absolutely phenomenal. And I'm hoping that, again, that you feel inclined to participate. Recognizing again that we have such a variety of practice workers who are here in any kind of setting in the social and health sectors. So you may be coming into this session again from a very trauma-specific lens that you do your work, or maybe you're looking again to share some dialogue and some critical analysis, I guess, of kind of how we continue on our way to become more and more trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, trauma-aware, and the impacts of colonization and how we're all striving to, again, come at this approach within this province from a very hybrid model, looking at a variety of ways of knowing. So I welcome everyone today, and I thank you for joining in again. Again, a true privilege to be here with all of you, and I hope that today we can foster again some rich dialogue about our learnings, our sharings, our insights, but also recognizing the impacts of the disenfranchisement of us. And I was really touched by your honesty and ability to share last week. Disenfranchised trauma and grief for all of us who have been helpers. I think and hope that today feels like another building block for us to acknowledge the hard work that each of you are doing to help support the people across this province. But again, from a trauma stewardship lens, to recognize the privilege in that work, but also the cost to that work on ourselves. And I want to thank all of the teams for their patience. We had hoped to have kind of this up and running earlier this autumn, but again, I really believe in embodying trauma-informed practice and trying to be much more mindful about my own practice and my own kind of nervous system and what's needed for me to stay well. And I think the more that we're able to model this in our practice, the better able that we will become in strengthening kind of how we're approaching this in the best ways that we can these days. So I have, again, a PowerPoint. Again, if you have a pen and paper, I wanted to kind of have a bit of a moment to kind of stop and do a little bit of self-reflection. I hope no matter where you are today, if you're sitting comfortably in your pajamas at home, or if you are scurrying around your office trying to be as mindful as you can to practice. We talked a lot about multitasking and the impacts of that. But no matter how you're showing up today, whether, again, this is the best Monday of your life or one of the hardest, I want to recognize and welcome each of you. I see someone has a raised hand, so if you would like to unmute or use the chat, welcome.
Yeah, so we are using a webinar format. So we're going to ask people to use actually the chat for talking and sharing with one another. Please make sure that you either mention, you know, everyone or not, or there's a Q&A, which is a separate button, and that goes directly to Serena, so it helps us focus. But we are actually not unmuting anyone, so please use the chat or Q&A for that.
But please continue to participate. This makes
this. I'm sorry that it's not. It's just that we've had experiences with Zoom bombers. And so as a result of that, to keep us all safe, we are not letting anyone unmute.
So look forward to hearing your comment come in still. So I'm going to bring up the PowerPoint slides that I created today. And I'm going to rely on N to kind of stop when there's questions, comments. Again, I really want this to be very collaborative. There's so much wisdom in this group and want to continue to share that wisdom.
Yeah, and it's possible that people are just playing with the bottom of your Zoom. You should see reactions. And so it's possible that's where you would raise your hand, but that it's also where you would maybe put a heart, like a lot of people have been doing hearts to say how much they appreciate you, Serena, and the work you're doing. Yeah, so there's the thumbs up. So it's possible that someone might have just accidentally clicked on raise hand instead of, see, there you go. And that's a great way to just share the love and react in addition to a chat. If you want Q&A, that's a separate link. Although I will be monitoring the chat and just like I did last week and interrupting periodically or waiting for a space. So yeah, there I am. And there's all of Serena's wonderful slides. Okay.
Well, that's fun.
It is.
You mentioned playing with the buttons and I should have been here.
No, you're good. So Serena, when you go back, if you go to view,
are we okay now?
Perfect. Yes, perfect.
Last week, we talked a lot about integrating our experiences, and I'm hoping that all of you will have the opportunity. Again, we wanted to start with you. So starting with the end in sight, I always kind of cringe a little bit when we tack on some real thoughtful discussion about self-care and disenfranchisement at the end. So I thought it was really important that we started with you in mind last week. And I want to continue with you in mind, with all of us as a collective in mind, and recognizing again that we all are coming into this space today carrying our professional lens of wanting to kind of, you know, collaborate and talk about peer supervision, peer leadership, peer facilitation, the things that bring this work, I guess, to some kind of excitement, I hope, for you, but also recognizing that we come into this space as persons ourselves who also carry the load. And I think last week, for those of you who were able to do the diagram and some of the sharing, it's just a recognition again that the last few years have been maybe increasingly a little bit more difficult for people, just given again the side effects and the pandemic and the ways that we've been pushed to work and to practice and to continue to try to live our personal lives in the most best way that we can, but also recognizing that some of this at the end of the day, we're also trying to integrate in our own ways into our own psyches. Last week, we talked a little bit about this, almost feeling again like an existential crisis that many of us have been through, and trying to navigate the importance of what we're learning through this and healing. So last week when we drew your diagram, again, we always come into a day, a space, a brand new week with a great plan, and then reality seems to seep in and it tends to look a wee bit different. So I always like to recognize, again, that we have the best laid plans, but the reality is we are always going to have the bumps and the hurdles and the obstacles in life. And this is true, again, from and with the people that we work with as well. So being able to look at our own lives through that beautiful, gentle, and inquisitive lens, but also being very aware that the people in which we support also are carrying many realities that we'll talk a little bit about today. So given that this was week 2 and going back to kind of the objectives that we started with, I wanted to kind of lean in a little bit more to what we talked about last week. And remember, we talked about the map. And very interesting to create a map, but if the map is not reflective of the territory, I always question whether the map is the most effective. So wanted to come back and talk a little bit more about how we intersect and pull apart the map and the territory from a community and a family lens. To me, this is the beauty of being a social worker, is that we do always look in context of environment, of family, community, the macro lens at a much broader level. So today is more about kind of looking at the meso lens and exploring that. I wanted to read this excerpt again from the book that I referred to some last week as well, as Becoming Trauma Informed. Thought this was a beautiful way to get us started this morning when we think about a map and a territory. So, and then again, sorry, the author is Nancy Poole and Lorraine Greaves. They are the editors for this book. What does it mean to be trauma informed? One morning as I was driving to work, I was listening to a trauma expert on the radio. This person was talking about the hundreds of children orphaned and traumatized by a tsunami, a hurricane, or some other brutal conflict. The interviewer asked the psychologist what could be done to help these children. His answer was essentially that we need to work to help them realize that the world is a safe place. Of course, the psychologist was speaking in compassionate tones and conveyed a sense of responsibility and a commitment to providing the kind of care, impossible in most of those circumstances, that would give that reassurance. But for me, he was only partly trauma informed. My question to anybody I talked to in the next few days was, where does he live that he thinks the world is a safe place? One of the main problems for any of us working in healthcare and social work and any type of treatment is the struggle to hold on to some version of a safe world for ourselves, where seeing the evidence and hearing the stories of trauma that offer other important and sometimes disturbing information, that for the world, for many people, it is not a safe place. So I think it's, again, a reference that trauma-informed, we must recognize that many helpers who provide all of our community-based services, be that in mental health, family violence, no matter where we work, that we may also have our own experiences of trauma, or that it may feel unsafe in our own private lives, even while we continue to try to offer safety and support to others. So I think, again, really important that helps to ground us and really think about a map and a territory really begs the questions of who's asking, like who's creating the map? And does that map, and we know that from all of our work, is that it's not a one size fits all. So as we continue to get in today, exploring the territory a little bit, I think it's really to kind of open up and look at what does it mean to be in community, to be in family. So I think for many of us, as we enter into, and for those of you who are outside of our province today, I welcome you. I'm hoping that you have at least had some opportunity to visit our province at some point. But again, very welcome in this space today. And I think about our entry point into this province. So you may be coming in through North Sydney, across from Newfoundland. You may be coming in the airport in Halifax metro area, or you may be crossing the border in Cumberland County, for those of you who are joining us today. But I think about us coming into this province, and I think it's ironic. We call this Canada's ocean playground. So again, I'm always caught by the beauty of this province. And I think about all of the ways that I do love living here. But I think it's so important that, again, I work from this place of understanding, again, the dichotomy of that pendulum. So while we have incredible beauty in this province, we also have incredible pain. And so today, to be able to look a little bit deeper into our communities as we get started, I want to kind of lay some of the foundation of this as we continue to move forward. I also want to really welcome people to interject, to talk about other experiences. It's hard to capture all of them, but I wanted to kind of lay some foundation as we begin today. So again, I'm weighing heavy again on quotes from bell hooks and others that I lean heavily on to do some of the deep dive work that we do. So bell hooks talks about the practice of love offers no place of safety. We risk loss, hurt, and pain. We risk being acted upon by forces outside of our own control. And I think that's so true as we all kind of took a moment last week to recognize kind of the impacts of this pandemic on our lives. But I want to extend that now to really think about the people that we're supporting and maybe the people that we haven't been able to support. And knowing that this province has also, again, while be it beautiful in scenery, it also has had a tremendous amount of loss and trauma impacts that we're going to get into kind of sharing a little bit to lay some foundation. Duran talks about the importance, and I think this to me is the most significant, that the knowledge of the trauma and how it affects a day-to-day life of community members still needs to reach the roots of community and community leadership. And I stopped to reflect, and I've done a lot of reflecting in the creation of this material and kind of what it means to me. And I think about some of the advocacy over the last couple of years for us to become much more trauma aware in this province, recognizing the various intersecting ways that our province has really been brought to its knees through the pandemic, through the historical context that again continues to elevate and be more and more conscious in recognizing the work we all have to do to decolonize this province. Also around the mass tragedies. And again, I want to highlight some of the ones that I have been through, but also recognize right across this province as I was doing a little bit of historical thinking on my walk. For many of you, you live in communities that you've also recognized more widespread community tragedies. I think it's important that some of the advocacy teams that I have worked with in the last couple of years, while we've been part of the public inquiry, it really has been to elevate and to talk more about trauma and grief in a more proactive way. I think it's recognizing that we have been through abnormal situations, and therefore we would expect that our whole bodies and our systems need to become more aware of kind of what people are experiencing. So I have a very dear friend of mine. We have done a tremendous amount of work. She continues to write to every level of government, again, reiterating the need for us to become more trauma aware, more grief literate, and understanding that our services and our systems need to shift into a much more proactive way of helping to support people through these difficult times. So I was really relying, again, Duran is the author on Healing the Soul Wound. that we talked about last week. And I thank you, Anne, for suggesting I will write these as you're doing your exercise. I'll make sure the books that I'm referring to are in the chat as well. But Duran talks about the soul wound. And I think, again, by the recognition of hybrid models of knowing and wisdom, and coming to this, I think it's so important that we are continuing. We're in the work, we're in the mire every day doing the work, but I think it's so important that our community leaders, I've often asked the question, it feels like at times that I feel like I'm speaking a completely different language as I've been trying to advocate. From a social justice lens, I really believe that trauma and grief are probably one of our most intersecting issues, biggest issues right now, that will probably connect all of us on this call today. So again, it is remiss of us to not recognize our history. Our history, again, and I think about a paper I wrote in grade 10 or 11, maybe, I don't know. But my final exam in a Canadian history class was Roots of the Present Lie Deep in the Past, go. And that always resonates for me about how important we are intersecting and really recognizing the historical context, again, of our residential schools here in this province, again, only closing in 1995. So our history is actually still very current. For those of you joining and recognizing, again, the history and the impacts of 400 years or more of colonization and racism for our Black communities, studying and understanding the demolition of Africville and so much of what community and safety has meant. I think about our Acadian populations here who have also been expulsed. And again, we think about our history and our land. So welcome to our beauty, but also please recognize our pain. I think that's so important. And as we go across Canada, we think about the impacts of Japanese internment. We think about all intersecting ways that we have been implicated by genocide, racism, colonization. And that to me is incredibly foundational when we continue to start moving ahead to look at family and individual practice. We have to understand the connection of where we've come from. We know that our present, more and more, again, roots of the past, roots of the present lie deep in the past. So again, as we see more and more movements, again, from a social justice lens, I think it's so important that we're recognizing as we're moving forward to bring these issues more and more to the light, more and more for discussion, that these are very interconnected from the intergenerational, transgenerational trauma and grief that so many people have endured here. Also want to recognize the implications, again, the beautiful connecting point of welcoming newcomers into our province and recognizing how important this is, that we are welcoming newcomers again, but recognizing for many people who have fled to our province, the recognition that there is also a history of trauma and grief. For some newcomers coming to this province, again, was not a top choice. Staying in their home countries may have been. So recognizing that we are in a place right now, and I think about our schools, I think about our community practices. It's one thing to welcome newcomers. It's another to actually start to become more and more trauma and grief literate, that we are responding to the long-term issues and connecting points. And I think about our agricultural migrant workers that work throughout the province as well, how this has become very complex and that we're not taking time to really look at what are the key issues of kind of how communities are functioning, or the pain in which some communities are really floundering right now. I think if we look at the manifestation of kind of how trauma informed is going on, I think it's important to stop and reflect upon kind of what's happening across our province as well, with incarcerations and overrepresentation of Indigenous populations. I think it's important that we're stopping to reflect about what our province, while again, it's Canada's ocean playground, it is also a province in which we have had a lot of trauma. We continue to see a lot of grief and loss. I think about homelessness and the impacts currently as we're seeing more and more needs rising with our economic challenges, how capitalism is affecting us right now. Also think about kind of, it's the first time in the last few years that I have really recognized from the urban rural centric lens that we have, how are we supporting the mental wellness of people in rural communities? Again, from agricultural contexts as well. I think about mental health for farming. There's lots of discussions I think that we're starting to enter into that are bringing, again, a bit of a common lens that we have got to look a little deeper into what's happening in our province. We look at socioeconomic challenges, we look at ageism, we look at sexism. These are all important connecting factors to be able to kind of peel this away before we get into family and individual practice. So important that we're taking a broad angle lens. Recognizing again, tomorrow is a day in our Canadian history that again connects us back to really stopping and really considering what does it mean for gender-based domestic violence and at all of the ways that this is intersecting. And as I was preparing for today, I took a few moments and want to kind of share a story that on December 6th of 1989, and I always run the risk now that I'm dating myself, I was actually at Mount St. Vincent University doing my first undergraduate degree. The night of December 6th, we received a call that we had also received a threat the night of the violence that occurred in Montreal. And I remember us being locked in our dormitories at the time, and we were asked not to come out until there was some safety. Again, we recognize the impacts right across our country, but I remember what it felt like to be locked in my home and be worried about what this was going to feel like, the fear and knowing what was happening some other place in our country, but it was also happening in some way that kind of trauma response was happening within ourselves as a group of women that were in our dorms at Mount St. Vincent. Never could I have imagined spinning ahead many more years to recognize that I would once again be locked in my home with the threat of a mass violence impact again. And I think it's so important that I was really taken aback by how many people would use the narrative about, and romanticizing what it's like here in Nova Scotia or in any part of our country, that those things don't happen here, when we know historically and current state that things have happened here and probably will continue. And I think it's important that, again, when we recognize breaking the silence, stopping the violence, these are all important connecting points. But also what I do want to say is that I am so pleased that we are actually memorializing and recognizing the impacts of this date and seeing kind of how important it is not to be forgotten for the events that are shaping us or kind of blocking us from having the dialogues that we need to have. Reflecting back, I think it's interesting, and I was drawing upon another author, again, in a book called Collective Trauma, Collective Healing. And this is an interesting, in a study of 142 disasters, they found that those which had the greatest impact were those in which two or more of the following were present: extreme and widespread damage to property, serious and ongoing financial problems, a deliberate human cause, an impact associated with previous traumatic events such as injury, loss, or threat to life. An inevitable consequence, collective trauma is the shared injuries to a population's social, cultural, and physical ecologies. And I remember having this conversation within the municipality to be able to talk a little bit about the impacts, again, from a Colchester lens only, but again, this was only because I lived here. I'm constantly really reiterating the fact that our entire province needs to kind of recognize the collective wounding that has happened. But I said, it's very interesting as the media pulls out after a tragedy of any sort, what we're left with trying to kind of gain footing again. And one of the things that I asked the question was, why do we continue to put wealth before health? And if we were to really look at kind of how people were doing and how they're navigating these traumatic responses past the events of the 48 hours or the 1 week, how would we be able to look at collective healing in a whole different way? And to me, this impacts family well-being. And I use an example this weekend where there was a mass grid power shutoff that later came out that was actually because of vandalism. And as I was talking to people who were incredibly impacted, we had seniors who were incredibly cold, 4 or 5 hours with no power again. Plus, it also evokes a trauma response. Many people in these communities have gone through Fiona. And again, the impacts of devastation to their homes and long periods of time without power. So again, coming back to those first conversations about who defines safety for people. But when I was talking to a few people about the impacts this weekend of the vandalism, I thought how interesting it is that again, how do we know that the acts of vandalism are not part of a trauma response of an individual? And again, we don't want to get into the right wrong, but what we are saying and making space for is that we know how people are integrating this challenging time. And I think it's so important that we're really stopping to reflect upon the intersecting ways that trauma can beget trauma. And we know that to be true. So for us to stop and really reflect on the fact that one event can have such a ripple effect, and so important that we're taking time to really stop and reflect on those challenges. When we get into looking at family-centered practice, what's happening in the pulse in our communities, to me, has a very big effect on our community, our families. So we know, and we talked about this last week a little bit about the impact. It's so impactful that we have become so reactive. And I think it's powerful when we look at so many times in history that we come back and we keep backing up and going ahead to realize that we react in maybe the same ways, even though we have a new body of knowledge about trauma, about adverse childhood reactions. And I think it's important that we start to think about all of those things and how do we start to bring these into a more proactive light. To me, grief and trauma has a way to be able to kind of help people process in a way before we start to see manifestations of symptoms of, PTSD, anxiety, depression, all kinds of things that oftentimes will get suppressed during traumatic events. So as we come back, I want to think about the service providers who are truly informed about traumatic learning, commit to consciously participate in creating greater safety for their clients, as well as for themselves. The focus of the work involves building relationships that take trauma into account as part of a complex and contexted life experience that may exist on both sides of the helper-helped divide, and providing support, information, and understanding as much experience of safety as we can manage. And I know if you say that right now and thinking about how much you've been able to manage, I think that really shows the impact. And we talked about that last week, the impact on your own shoulders of kind of being in that helping profession for all of us across the province. If in the process we happen to open up the space to hear the story of trauma in a context of connection where the person can have some control over this disclosure experience, and we must be prepared to really hear and respectfully attend to the layers of meaning in every unique story and to the vulnerability of the telling. I apologize for getting distracted. This is the consequence because I'm trying to honor the stories that you're sharing as well, and how many of you are also connecting to different parts of pieces that we've talked about from our historical and current context right now. So as we get into wanting more and more techniques of how to work with someone through grief and loss, I think it's so important that we realize first that every one of us are connected in some way to an external environment, and how important. So coming back to some key questions to think about, as we think about moving into this and working with an individual is, what do I know and what do I not know about this person's identity? What do I know and not know about their own past experiences of trauma and grief and loss? How might they identify in relation to intersectional identities and intersectional traumas? And I think these things are so important when someone presents to us in our own way to recognize that there's so many layers. What is the impact of this person's intersectional identities on their own experiences of trauma? What is the impact of colonization and intersectional or transgenerational connections? So again, what role does any of these violences play in relation to this person's mental health concerns? Do colonialism, racism, ageism, sexism, homophobia, or other forms of intersectional violence intersect them that potentially amplify their current experience? So I think it's important that as we're thinking about community and what is happening in community, again, not what's wrong with our communities, but really what is the pulse of what's happening across the province. And as we see that, again, geographically, there may be different areas within the province that are being affected by different things. I think it's so important that we have some foundation of understanding that what's happening to the individual has often a very bigger context to what's going on. So we do become trauma and grief denying in some ways. To me, I think it's kind of that invisible, and some people will call it the invisible pandemic that's affecting all of us. Viktor Frankl will come back to say a normal reaction to an abnormal situation is actually normal behavior. So what we may be seeing on the day-to-day are the reactions of people who, again, are struggling with, again, the supports, the connection, the intersectionality of potential traumas. And Peter Levine, again, well-renowned author, worker in trauma, will talk about trauma being the most avoided, ignored, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. Would you agree that across the province right now, there are so many intersectional ways that people are experiencing trauma and loss? And I'm sure that each of you are seeing this in so many ways within your own work. So when we think about some of it, and I appreciate, again, those of you chiming in all the different ways that you are, again, I want to make sure that we're all having an opportunity to reflect on this and to share your ideas and thoughts. Some theories of change talk about, and we know I attended an amazing, and I'm not sure if my colleague is on here, I was trying to think of the name, that did a phenomenal social work lens of adverse childhood experiences, and was really so thought-provoking to me about how we know this. And we really want to think about a resilient community. We really have to start with really thinking about these adverse childhood experiences. And many of you are talking about the impacts of wanting to know more and more how to work alongside children, youth, because I think they're foundational for the long term. So again, I'm just drawing on some of the resources that I've been pulling upon for all of the different work to think about this, for the ACES Coalition to really think about pathways to change. And what I really love about this is that, again, it's deconstructing the map and the territory. And it's really helping us to be informed more about the programs, the services, the systems that affect and have the outcomes towards the individuals. So the map and the territory consistently keep coming back. Thank you for sharing that name. I appreciate that. So if we were to stop and pull back from a community lens, so let's do a little bit more dive on the community territory. And we think and we know about children and youth. And I always believe that this whole notion that children should be seen and heard and believed, but I would probably add that they also deserve to be safe and nurtured and supported. And we know that that is not the case for every child, and we know that the impacts are huge. So I think it's important that we stop and we reflect upon having this ACEs information, and that knowing that we have communities who are going through tremendous amounts of trauma and grief, how important these stories and these sharings and this absolute need for safety and support. And my colleague Tracy and I have had multiple discussions, again, even kind of processing the events of our the mass casualty here, about different ways that we've seen the impacts of trauma and loss be affected by within the context of schools and families. And I know all of you have such deep stories to share. But to me, it's also really important that ACEs also affect us across the lifespan. And I know in preparing this and thinking about a family-centered approach, I think it's important that we stop kind of just, again, this isn't just about children, it's really across the lifespan of recognizing our seniors who have been so impacted again by the pandemic and isolation and loneliness that we're seeing in our communities. Again, that some of these are also very triggering for their own life experiences that they've had. So I want to keep coming back to recognize the World Health Organization, so many other people talk about we need to be more preventative and proactive about adverse childhood experiences, but we also need to be deeply, deeply aware across the lifespan for our adults, for us all on this call, but as well for our seniors along the way, that this is impactful across our lifespan. So for those of you, I think it's important that we always have an ability to do a deeper dive and encouraging people. I have a few videos that I really wish I was able to share on here today. I don't really like this whole narrative of just talking. But again, coming back to the different pathways of adverse childhood experiences. And for those of you who don't have a lot of familiarity, there's a diagram here that kind of shares some of the impacts and kind of what we need to be doing. So SchoolsPlus and myself, we've been working really hard with different varying community agencies to really look at how do we provide space and skilled folks that are skilled and encourage and wanting to do group work, but also kind of having those tools maybe within their own toolbox about what it's like to be able to talk about some of the traumatic and loss, grief and loss experiences that people and children and youth have had. So important again, though, as we look across the lifespan, and I always kind of come back to this about our elders, our seniors, and despite our denial, we're all old people in training, and to become old often means to become the other in our Western context. So sad that we have kind of othered, and I think about the impacts for staff and families through Northwood and other long-term care facilities and the impact of this pandemic. I think it's so important that the whole lifespan and again, the beauty and the pain of people, again, I don't want to lose sight that both of those coexist. So foundationally, we think about trauma-informed. We think about, again, safety is huge. And when we talk about the fact that not everyone feels safe, and safety has been something I think that's been very much shaken for many of us, I think this is a hard time that we are really trying to regain footing. We're trying to rebuild safety, coming back to schools, going back into social settings. So many people talked about the impacts of fear, and I still see that and hear that from people that they aren't ready to join in other social events and things like that. So when we hear those things, we also know that there is an impact of trauma that we want to be very cognizant of with people. So if our safety has been shaken, I think it's so important that we're building spaces, creating spaces that we're able to talk about those impacts. So trustworthiness, being able to be supportive in a way that rebuilds trust for people, because I really believe a lot of that has been shaken over the last few years. Choice. That to me, and I really want to talk about kind of the impacts of some of that and choice and control. One of the things that I found very difficult when we start to look at one way of knowing I think, is that we're not really thinking about how we're supporting people, that their voices, their needs, their cultural contexts, their safety have to come first and foremost. So I think it's important that within our system, sometimes we often offer a kind of a one size fits all. And I think that has become a very big challenge for us, that we know that. And I think for those of us all continuing to be out there shouldering what we can with this right now, I think we're at an interesting intersection point. And I, for one, would love to get rid of the narrative of going back to normal. I hope we can go forward and build something that actually feels that it is more trauma informed throughout our province, that really relies on listening to people and collaborating with people and co-creating ways to exist in our communities. I think that is essential right now as we come through the thaw of this, the impacts of all of this over the last few years. And I think it truly has to become more of a process of empowering and listening and sharing with people who have their own innate, again, communities. One of the biggest things as we're going in to talk at the conference, and this in a couple of months out in Manitoba from the emergency measures, they wanted us to talk as a keynote about kind of the impacts of the mass tragedy here, one of the mass tragedies here in Nova Scotia. And I think it's so important that we talk about, from a rural context, did we listen to the people? And I have often used the small C culture, because I think there's a big difference between kind of the services that we may have offered in urban centers versus what may be available in rural centers, and how we all work together in a very maybe different way because of limited resources, or different ways that we have to see our nonprofits and our government systems work together. I think there's both, again, beauty and pain in that we can be creative, but I also think that there's been a lack. And I keep hearing many of my colleagues say, how do we continue to go through such big events with no additional resources? So these are important things to me when we're thinking about community. And I just, again, want to take a snapshot of what community is such a broad context, but really reflecting on some highlighted parts of being in Nova Scotia right now, and things that we need to think from our historical and current context. Where do we go to really look at deepening our awareness and creating environments that feel more trauma informed? What other, I'm curious, and do you have any comments? I kind of sometimes lose sight of the chat because I get distracted reading, but are there other community issues that you would bring forward right now that are so important to name?
Yeah, so please everyone put in the chat. There's been great conversation and connections between people, but I don't see anyone adding anything right this second. So, but y'all just add into the chat and we will integrate you into that conversation. Just a little note of reminder that this is very strong personal stuff as well. So it brings up a lot of feelings for us all. Safe, available, affordable housing is one response. Reflecting on choice when resources are limited, choice may not be available. Housing vacation day program for individuals living with disability. There was a really great insight about how the capitalist economic situation is robbing people of the ability to hope for a home, and the ways in which that is leading to profound grief, presumably like generational and intergenerational. Those are the comments that are coming in. Food insecurity, helplessness at the divisiveness of politics. Basic income for all without stigma. Amount of poverty we are all facing right now, especially our rural communities. Healthcare, wellness care, prevention of physical and mental unwellness outside of the medical model. Climate change, development and proposed development happening on ecologically fragile and valuable land near waterways. Golf courses, exhaustion and overwhelmed service sector. Do want to invite everyone to stay connected with us in March, because we are going to be doing a massive advocacy day where we are going to just slam our elected leaders and let them know how many people care about these issues. Loss of healthcare, lack of support for refugees in rural Nova Scotia, lack of multilingual social workers or mental health services. So there's that as well. Lack of affordable, appropriate housing. It's also an increasing problem with patients who are palliative, which is another area that needs more work in general, is how we talked about death and dying, which is also coming up. So yeah, Serena, you are reaching everyone and bringing up a lot of stuff. Assistance for new Canadians, recent immigrants, healthcare and housing, absolutely. Another issue that's only going to increase if our government's plans of doubling the population by 2060 are to become reality. Lack of resources, financial and housing for seniors. That brings us back to that wonderful slide about elders who are being othered.
I really thank you for this, because again, this is the wisdom of us being in a collaborative model today about this. Again, here we stand in Canada's ocean playground that has both beauty, but also the analogy I'm thinking of is that it also has an incredible impact of minefields, of a lot of strain, a lot of challenge, that we have a long way to go. But underneath this, I think it's so important that all of the things you're bringing up, and I really appreciate, I'm sitting and reading all of these right now, how important this is for us to be more trauma informed. There's so many intersectional ways. So I thank you for all of your comments and all of the different ways that you bring your passion for the work you do, for the services you provide, and the ones that were really hitting barriers and walls, obstacles about moving forward. So it's one thing to have trauma-informed philosophies, but just how are we going to conceptualize this if we can't kind of stop and look at the commonality, I guess, of the challenges about how people experience trauma and grief. So many of these, all of the ways that you're sharing, I think, are so impactful, from the politics to the climate to housing to employment to capitalism to all of these things. Again, really bring us back to, it's so, you know, if I had have leaped in here on day one to say, here's how you work with an individual, first, you probably would have said whatever, because I think that we really have to look at the impact, again, of so many intersectional ways that trauma and grief is experienced by people. And I think that's, to me, the very foundation of this work. So where we take what we're hearing, again, and then we start to know that this is a complex province. And again, I'm zeroing in on this province, just again, from the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, but I also extend this to everybody on the call, no matter where you're chiming in from. I think, again, the intersectionality of issues, I would love to hear more and more from you. So important, though, that I think what's happening in our communities, what's happening in our global context, I think is so impactful for our families. And I was thinking about kind of sitting and talking as both of my children were impacted by the power outage on the weekend. And again, really talking about from a trauma-informed lens, because we know that there's so much frustration building. And so how we navigate these conversations in our families, and the conversations we can and cannot have as people who are helpers, as those who are needing support through our services. I think that the challenge, again, about equity right now and service provision, to me, has become a very, very complex issue. So it's important, as we start to delve into a little bit more about family-centered care, that we're really being mindful to think about the community complexities, again, affect us at our dinner table if we are privileged enough to have a dinner table. So I want to take a moment with your pen and paper, and just want to, again, take a little bit of time to reflect on, for you, what does family, how would you create Would it be a family tree? Would it be some other image? And I'm just going to ask everybody again, because this practice is really about us coming together to have some space for critical reflection. I'd love you to just stop for a moment and really think about, in any kind of visual way, what does family mean for you? And I'm just going to stop for a few minutes. We'll have some silence, and please do some drawing, some words, and we'll come back and share. I want to recognize, as we talk about this exercise again, that this can both be an exercise that again evokes both the beauty and or the pain. But I think again, an inside approach to the external work that we do is often a really big part of reflection for myself. And I appreciate some of you are sharing here again that exercise. So I just want to kind of acknowledge maybe some of you had parents. Some of you have not been sure where to put your parents on this. Some of you have gaps that you haven't been able to talk about. Some people have done this exercise and told me that there's like branches laying on the ground. I really want to just kind of make space again to understand kind of each of us and how many people are currently on our call right now. So with approximately 180 people on the call, how important it is that everyone's concept and understanding of family is very unique to them. So I'd just like you to think, and if you feel okay to share, like, you know, what do you discover when you think about family? And then when I kind of talk about grief and loss, for some of us, we have had experiences that have really divided us in ways, losses that maybe caused a lot of pain or challenges within our family. Maybe there were other circumstances. And if we even think about the last couple of years in which we felt more united with our family. So I'm just going to look at some of the comments that you're sharing here, and I appreciate this. Family to me conjures words like love, support, safety, and community, but I recognize having these as a privilege that has not been granted to everyone. Powerful. Family are the people who you choose, and who choose you. Family means some people to share good times and bad times. I think that these are really important. Family can be very complicated. Broken branches, new growth, worn bark, love and gifts, closed, open, stress and trauma, forgiveness, frustrating, fun, work, safety, comfort zone. What a beautiful mosaic of words. Thank you for sharing that. Important to recognize that sometimes family isn't related, but a community that you have built. And I appreciate that as well. Family certainly does not have to be blood related. Again, your inner circle, the people that you get to define. Family are people and pets in one inner circle. So really appreciate just taking a few, again, words like family, and I appreciate that sharing as well. It can be very painful for many. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the context even of the time of year that we're in right now, and how exercises like this can be really challenging. So please do the things to keep looking after yourselves right now, and just what you're sharing, I very much appreciate. For some people, you're talking about a circle of safety. Who are the people in your neighborhood? I foster and have adopted, so family is a part of your life, world, support, care, for love. For some people, family to me means love, support, and a nurturing environment and protection. Family is also the core of my being. It includes biological, but not all biological components. It includes external relationships, and over time, sometimes the core shifts that can be very lonely and painful. Really appreciate this, because I think that's exactly, so it's very difficult to talk about family-centered care when we really have such a diverse understanding of the entire word family. And for some, it can mean safety, and for some, it does not mean safety at all. Someone else is saying here about healing wounds. And we know that this is the complexity when we take about what's happening in our community, and then we kind of are trying to process all of this. And I think about stories along the way. I had a very dear elder talk to me about the challenge that in her lineage of a grandmother who had to make decisions about children going to residential school and not. And I think about all of the different ways that families have these trauma events that really reshape. And we come back to talking about last week, I mean, trying to overcome some of the things that we've tried to overcome and trying to become who we can be. But again, those wounds are big. And again, that's where I lean heavily on Duran's work about these soul wounds that happen within ourselves, but also in the context of whatever family means to us. And I think that when we start to delve into this, we start to look at kind of the ways that family can be both beauty and pain. So for some people, we come together in close ways, and I've often done an exercise with people to think back to kind of some of your very first experiences with a loss. And if we consider, you know, one loss that we've had, maybe even through death and dying, and some people talk about a pet that they've had, and kind of how some families would talk about the physicality of that loss, and others would talk about the emotionality of it, and that we would grieve together. Many people would talk about the fact that no, we really didn't have that kind of connection together. And again, there's no right or wrong in this. I think it's important that we're all kind of coming again. And that's why, to me, to pull an individual out of a family setting and work in isolation and without understanding some of the context around this becomes part of our challenge. So thinking about and working with their environment to the best of our ability, I think, is important. And we'll get into a few more techniques of kind of what that means around grief and loss. So sometimes when we think about the relationships that we've had along the way in our own family tree, or when we think about the people that we're supporting, some people get to say goodbyes, and goodbyes come in different ways. And I think I've shared in other contexts, I mean, the thought about divorce and family breakup. And I rely on the wisdom of my own children, who once said to me that you don't know what it's like to miss someone all the time. When we're with you, we miss our dad. When we're with dad, we miss you. And recognizing that, again, we can take adverse childhood experiences, but how do we conceptualize these in the context of our own family to say, I hear you, I see you, I value you. This is not about you becoming resilient. This is becoming us as a family, creating a narrative to talk about and allow grief to be very much a part of our lives. So I think about breakups that happen in our families, and we know through the impacts of this pandemic that we've seen more and more. I think about, you know, the deaths that we've had, and I think about the people who have had the opportunity to say goodbye, and for some, they didn't have the chance. I think about moves into any kind of institutional care, whether you are, you know, working through a group home setting, through a prison setting, through a long-term care setting, a hospital setting. I think it's important that we really think about that. Sometimes we're bringing people to institutional care because we are so in need of help, but that's a goodbye that becomes very complex, and it will always evoke some form of grief that I think is important, that sometimes we don't have the narrative to talk about. I've often talked about my time working in corrections and how much I used to cringe working on June 21st, because June 21st was Family Day. And for those women who were incarcerated, whether you lived in Labrador or sometimes in Saskatchewan or wherever, but in Nova Scotia or in the Maritimes, we all knew that we only had one prison for federally incarcerated women. Therefore, on Family Day, many people didn't get to have who they defined as family come to see them for economic, for geographic reasons, for fractures in families. And that became such a day where the trauma and the grief was so palpable that, again, helping to find narrative to talk about those things was so important. So there's so many ways that we get to say goodbye, and sometimes we don't get to. And these show up in our family trees, but they're also very much a family-centered care from the people that we're supporting along their experiences as well. I think about the impacts of parenting as part of kind of looking at our own family trees as well. And I think that's impactful when we think about people who have been unable to conceive, and that's very much a part of their tree and their own experience with trauma and grief, that people sometimes are very negligent and harmful in the conversations that they have. And there's this expectation, again, in Western culture about what family looks like and what couples and all of those things that I think become very impactful. But I also think within our family, there are goodbyes that we haven't been able to acknowledge. And I think about a dear friend of mine who had who talked to me one time about, I think in the 1970s, she had had a miscarriage that she said that she will forever hold in her heart. And she said, you know, she grieves for that child and not being able to really name it in a way. So again, some of the postnatal work, but also for those women, again, who have had miscarriage, who have had abortions. Again, we think about the complexities in our families and these kind of spoken about versus kind of the silenced trauma and grief. And it was really important to me when I was doing a lot of counseling that people would often come in wanting to share some experience, but it was only moments later they would talk about the impact within their family over a loss that was never allowed to be spoken about, or one that they felt maybe got very much minimized. We also think about parents who have experienced the death of their children. And again, I want to reiterate that this is very much across the lifespan. I was sharing with someone one day that I had the privilege of having lunch with a 106-year-old woman who was just amazing to talk to. But reflecting on that, I thought, you know, the wisdom in that beautiful woman's eyes, because here she was at 106, she actually had to say goodbye to all of her children. She had outlived all of them. And I think there's things that we really don't get to talk about when we start to name our family trees. And we all can feel that there's these kind of quiet spots or spots that we don't know whether to put on our tree, losses that maybe we haven't had an opportunity to talk about. And I appreciate what you're all talking about again. And I say unemployed in this, but I really do recognize, to me, that this is really coming back to the structures of our community right now and the losses of employment, the losses of meaningful jobs, that people have come to this province with expectations to be able to participate in ways that were so important to them. And I think it's so important that there's so many ways that people, again, we other people when they're not productive, again, from a very capitalistic lens. So it's important when we start to think about kind of how people are navigating these days, and within our families, these losses, job injuries that happen, workplace injuries, people that have been very passionate about their employment. There's a huge sense of loss when they're not being able to participate in the way I think about. And now, again, from a psychological safety, really concerned across our province of how many people are needing to leave their jobs in ways, again, because we're not being able to create the psychological safety at work to be able to support and care for people. This isn't so much about the physicality. This is really how are our workplaces becoming more trauma informed? How are we becoming grief literate? How are we supporting? So I often say for a lot of people that have gotten into a narrative of not being able to find workers, I often say, are our workplaces shifting to the current needs? Our map and our territory look dramatically different than they did years ago. But all of these can bring tremendous loss. I think about the impact of illnesses in our families, and I recognize that someone have put a very powerful comment again. So, I mean, again, it's so dependent on the illnesses that our families are experiencing these losses. We know that substance use, again, which was we were watching The Wisdom of Trauma. For those of you who haven't had the opportunity to watch Gabor Mate's documentary on the wisdom of trauma, and we just went through that as a group last week, and we're having a lot of narrative about substance use and addiction rates again. But underneath of all of this is so much trauma and grief that people have not been able to discuss. I look at longitudinal studies after mass events, and we know that illnesses, we know that ACEs can create shorter lifespans. So it's illnesses that are happening across our life trajectories that underneath of this is, again, a huge impact of trauma and grief that we've not been able to process and help as well, with a health system that is incredibly taxed right now. So I've used the analogy in other teachings that if I were to have 3 children and I were to say that one of them is struggling with a heroin addiction, another one has been recently diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the third has a cancer diagnosis, I often ask that question, and again, and you're thinking about your family tree and how this affects our families, I think about which of those children have, which one do we get to talk about, and which ones, again, do we silence? And so I see so much bias that comes into our families and gets reenacted about who and how we can talk about illness in our families. The same with death. I think coming back to thinking about, you know, the multiple ways that people, and again, I'm starting to hear more and more people starting to talk about the ways that they had to say goodbye to their loved or their people that they have in their life through digital. Again, the impacts of kind of what we were not allowed to do. But again, for some people, there were so many compounded losses of death that happened during the last few years. For some people, they said it's kind of been compounded, it's become complex. And trying to pull these apart to kind of grieve each one of these losses in a very meaningful way at a time when a lot of our rituals were very much disrupted. And this has impacted our families. And I know at the beginning of the pandemic, many people, when I was working in my job with Nova Scotia Health, were talking about delayed grief. And I was really cognizant of the fact that I really am hopeful that we can create meaningful rituals in the best way they can, because I was concerned at the time, which has only been reiterated, that we're only going to compound the different losses that have happened. So having creative ways, I think, that we're able to process the different ways that we all in our family context. And I don't think that that has been, again, I'm not convinced that we have a really great literacy rate for grief and loss in our families, because I don't see it evident yet in our communities either. Also want to come back to the recognition again, and this would only be one calendar, and it was a quick snapshot because I didn't want to miss recognizing there are many ways that we look at holidays from different cultural contexts. We also know, sorry about that, that this is a very challenging time. Oh my goodness, I'm all over the place here. Back up, Serena. You're such a patient crowd. I know even over the weekend, I think my referrals went through the roof this weekend of people seeking counseling. We know that the closer we get, the more we perpetuate the closeness and connection of holiday season time, that those people, all of us who are feeling disconnected, lonely, isolated, this can be a really profound time. I think, and Rebecca and I were talking at the beginning of this session, just for so many intersecting ways that as the year's coming to a close, the weariness that we feel, this expectation that we're supposed to be and do certain things this year, I think can really perpetuate. And for families that have had losses, this gets really compounded. Right now, I think it becomes so much more evident. So there's this dichotomy of cheerfulness, beauty and pain, right? Where people are sometimes oblivious to what's happening around them economically, socially, with so many different losses that people are experiencing and seem to get so compounded at this time of year. So coming back again, want to recognize and look at a hybrid acknowledgement of the medicine wheel, recognizing the importance of all of the tools, again, that we have from multiple ways of knowing. We know that even this time of year, but even in a family context, what we might be looking at from an individual lens, we need to apply this at a very broad sense about how our families are doing physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. So one of the tools I think that's important is that we're able to do a proactive look at this. And I've often encouraged families and individuals, what are some things we're going to need? Again, coming back to even planning for the next holiday season, few weeks ahead of us, I always encourage people, again, what are our plan A and our plan Bs? So the physicality of a holiday coming up, and what does that mean for our budgets? What does it mean for our movement? Do we want to be with people? Do we need to feel a sense of solitude as a family? Do we want to get together with everybody? Do we want to pare it down? And I think it's so important that we're really looking at this through a lens of being proactive, recognizing that it is stirring a tremendous amount of a trauma response, as well as a lot of grief and loss that comes forward. So emotionally, and I find this an interesting time of year. My sister asked if I wanted to go to a concert, and recognizing that we are also in the throes of an anticipatory grief experience. I said I'm not able to go to that. Not that I'm afraid to cry, just because I know for this year it's way too raw. And so I think that those are important things, that I can find spaces to allow myself to cry, to allow myself to bring out trinkets that have been memorable, those kinds of things that emotionally, that we can still find places of having quiet joy, having sadness, the frustrations, the anger of, I think all of them are very much an important part, but really thinking about what is it I need? Are there certain people that I need? So I'm always cheering for people who are asking for referrals right now, because they're reaching out to say, I need some support. And so emotionally, I see that as a very proactive way to say, I really need some guidance right now. I need someone here in my corner. Sometimes that's our friends. So I apply that to us as well, knowing that this time of year can be incredibly taxing on us as helpers. Again, what do we need to emotionally kind of support ourselves in this? Socially, again, we come back to kind of that connection versus solitude. How do we find that flow to be able to do what we can for this? And again, spiritually, to me, when we come back to the whole idea of soul wound, I think this is so important that we're seeking out those places of peace, of quiet, if we're able to find those, and those can be in gentle moments. I get distracted here once in a while because in this home that I'm living in, I actually went out and placed 3 or 4 bird feeders. And again, those are very quiet ways, gentle ways that I remind myself of kind of being connected to nature in the best way I can in a new environment. Now, as we get into next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of the theoretical and some of those developmental kinds of pieces of family-centered care as we get into more of the individual practices. But I often want to pay tribute to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a bit of our grief guru. And I consider her a wise, sage pioneer in our life, but I often consider her a little bit like Sigmund Freud. So delighted we've had them, but I think it's so important that we're moving on beyond. So I want to acknowledge her tremendous work, but also recognize that some of that language, that I call it the seduction of the stages, which again, I've really kind of wiped out this whole energy around this language. I'm not convinced that things move in any kind of stage like this, I guess, but really looking at words like denial and acceptance and depression as part of a grief trajectory. Those are all things that I've kind of moved away in my own practice to really think about and kind of allow people to explore, what does this mean to you? So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but what I want to come back to is the fact in a family-centered practice is that oftentimes we'll hear people talking about this. Well, so-and-so is in denial. And oftentimes when we say those kinds of things, we know that they're not being said probably in the most gentle and compassionate ways. So I often say to people, as we continue to keep moving away from kind of medicalizing and pathologizing people's grief, we're looking for new narratives to be able to talk and explain the situation, the kind of what's happening with people. So I often will share with families, it may feel like we're on a bit of a roller coaster, and just using some metaphorical language around what it might feel like. And this might be one suggestion. So when I talk to a family, I might say, you know, if I'm talking, for instance, to a mom, what does this feel like? Like, does it feel like a bit of a roller coaster? And do you love roller coasters? And, you know, does it feel like you're a bit out of control, going really fast, going up and down, sometimes in reverse? And what does that feel like? And does it feel like a bit of a connection to what you might be experiencing? And they will either tell me something else that it feels like, or yes, that makes sense. But then I say there's this interesting thing that happens when we start to move into a family-centered grief, because it would be really great if everybody was kind of moving along at the same rate and pace, but that really is not what family-centered grief looks like. And we know that even from a moment of considering our own family tree, I think it's important that this is a very complex process, that we're expecting a unit who has come with their own historical context to try to figure out. For some, again, these things can divide, they can unite. And again, it's a lot of complex communication that we're working with. One of the things that I come back to from the compassionate communities model, and they talk a lot about kind of who are the helpers. And if we think, and I'm delighted to see somebody mentioned about palliative, the palliative experience, I think about kind of from a palliation process, Pallium Canada tells us again about kind of 10% of the day are these formal workers, 90% of the day are these beautiful souls that work out of community and family, and that we're all kind of doing the caring. But when I come back to Mary Lou Kelly's connection to this, which I really appreciate, is that she's talking about death and or grief is not fundamentally a medical event. They really are a social events that happen in our family, in our communities. And therefore, that's where we need to kind of start to apply what is needed and how are we going to help support. What gets confusing again is around the equity. Who gets support for trauma and grief? Where do we go to get it? How has it been informed? Is it what's needed? And I often come back it's again, we're in a very complex time right now. And I think, are we acting for someone or are we acting with someone? And that's where I feel like for many situations that things are changing. And I was in New York at a conference in September, and I really applauded it. The whole conference was Voices for Resilience, and it was post 9/11. And here we were 21 years later, listening to people who had gone through a tremendous trauma and grief. And some people were actually lived survivors who had experienced what it was like being in the Twin Towers at the time. Very fascinating to me as we're listening to the things that were helpful to them and things that actually caused more harm. And so I think it's important that we have to change the narrative of what we think is most applicable. Again, we're in a more complex time, and I think it's really understanding how are the trauma and grief intersecting right now, and how do we continue to keep listening and developing and becoming much more conscientious about what kind of supports are needed. I always, when I come away, what I did applaud, and again, I was sitting with people who were across the globe talking about, mass violence and how that affects families, and it also affects our communities. But what I did think is how important it is that they're actually talking about it and bringing it to the light. And I thought it was very interesting as they talked about many events that happened. Sandy Hook, there was people there from all kinds of scenarios that have happened across the states as speakers at this conference. I thought it was interesting. They talked about one of the areas that they are most concerned with right now as youth male violence in the United States. And I thought how impactful to be sitting with a group of people that recognize the trouble that abounds and trying to figure out what are we going to do. because I think sometimes I get most concerned when we're met with silence and we're not being able to talk about the complexities of where we're at and where we're heading. That to me is this whole notion of really improving the literacy that we have and the need to be more proactive here. So grief literacy and trauma-informed literacy, very important to me, I think, and we often see this, we're swimming so much in all of this and all of the ways that you have shared with us as well in our province. I mean, this is all around us. It's like fish swimming in an aquarium and we're not even aware that the water's around us. So while I always come back to the fact that there's much beauty here, we also have to be very cognizant of all of the grief and trauma that we're also surrounded with here in this province, that our families are trying really hard to navigate. Duran would actually challenge us, and I am so pleased he does, in his book of Healing the Soul Wound, that we have to be really careful of creating a cookbook model. And thinking about the implications of that on families. And that to me is where intersectionality is so very important, that we're really thinking about the broad range of intergenerational, transgenerational, how trauma is affecting so many different people. So to me, there's not ever going to be a one size fits all. And I really applaud him for naming that a cookbook model that we bring off the shelf. And this is how we will always do this. I think we have to be really able to kind of deconstruct. And to me, this is always going to be on a continuum of growing and learning ourselves, of what's missing, whose voices are missing, what are we not considering. Not that we're striving for perfection, because I know our loads are heavy, but I think it's always trying to make our services as trauma-informed, grief literate, inclusive, and very much aware in ways that maybe we haven't been in the past. So again, coming back to family-centered practice and the family, very important to me that we don't just kind of drop it like we do with kids and say, oh, they're resilient. And we think that families are resilient. And those of us who work in this field understand that, you know what, all resiliency is taxed. And resiliency comes, again, at the crux of some of the hardest things that families have had to face. Do they face it all with grace and elegance? Do your families face it all with grace and elegance? Because I know mine doesn't. So I think it's really important that we think about resiliency as this dynamic process. And I think it's so important that we're thinking that there's a group of individuals that make up families with all of their own needs, but all of their own kind of history. And we bring in some of the attachment theory work, which we'll bring that in a little bit more next week, and how people have had past traumas and how that affects their attachments. And then we start to throw another crisis at people. And then those attachments and the profound impacts of those can start to intersect in ways that make this work a little bit more complex. When applied to grief, the more we assist our family unit to prepare and understand. And I think this is where I often think that if we were to do more and more grief literacy for families during all kinds of losses, we're going to help build their repertoire of understanding what is happening within their structure is a normal, natural reaction to something that has created a loss for them or possibly a crisis. So to me, I often say, and I've been saying this, I guess, throughout the work of the public inquiry, is that the more we can provide education and support to people, the more that I believe they can help promote that within their own families. And then that again starts to filter down into an individual lens. So I think the coaching model of really looking at what is grief, what is trauma, and I think the more that we can start to help people understand these responses, then I think they have the ability to start to understand in their families, how best do we work with this? Knowledge is power. So again, coming back to thinking about the respect for dignity and the value of family, no matter what your family looks like, no matter who constitutes your family and who doesn't. Again, this is why we move away from language about loved ones, knowing that not every family is filled with loved ones, and implying those kinds of things can be very, very hard for people. I think it's important that we recognize that healing and growth occurs at many levels. And even if the events and the outcomes cannot change, I always like to look at kind of how do we allow for meaning and making meaning, I guess, during collective processing and helping people understand kind of what's happening. How do we shift more power over to families and away from us? And I think that to me is the more that I'm practicing and understanding more of my own kind of lens to this, my self-awareness, constantly kind of unpacking my own backpack of understanding kind of how this is my family and the complexities it has. I'm more conscientious about working with another. So again, we know that there are many models of how we helped to build and support relationships and connectedness. But again, what does creating that safe environment and really looking kind of where does emotion fit in all of this as well, helping to support families. So working with family values to me becomes really important. And I think as you get to know families, you get to understand a little bit about the things that they value. And we can try to work with that again from a strength-based approach, whatever those values might be. And it might be, I often think about a dear woman I worked with and she was dying and the family kept coming in and whispering. And I jokingly said, she has 8 children. You grew up, and again, I'm going to stereotype, but you grew up in a Cape Breton home. When was the kitchen quiet? And, what is it that you think your mom is going to need to hear right now? And maybe that isn't just the silence, right? What were your values? What were you like as a family all through this? And was it loud and rowdy? And what will that feel like to be able to talk about and work with this process? So again, trying to understand the person in the center of this, which is oftentimes the person that we're working with, and how do we kind of keep eliciting family questions? One of the big questions that I will often ask when I'm doing family-centered work is kind of, can you tell me another time that your family went through a hardship? And what was that like for your family? Did it kind of unite you? Did it divide you? What did you notice? How did you kind of work with kind of that whole process? And I think you start to discover some seeds about that family's values and continue to kind of build that. Just one, again, for many people that we've had the chance to work together, I often talk about a family being a dance floor and how important a family's dance floor is to that family, and really being cognizant of us as workers to be as objective as we can and recognizing the times that we're getting onto a family's dance floor. So we think about kind of the back slide and thinking about kind of the person in the center and how easy it is to actually get ourselves up close and personal. And sometimes I understand that we are called onto those dance floors, but I often think about sometimes there are times when I'm more objective to realize that the more that I'm on that family's dance floor, that I am also losing sight of other people in that family. So being able from a grief lens to help support the family and kind of what tools and techniques can be really helpful for your family. How can I help support you that you can have the conversation with someone that you may need to have? So I've had different colleagues of mine who have talked about this fact that sometimes inadvertently we do get on the dance floor. We become very protective of certain people on the dance floor. We can start to get dragged into some of the emotional context of other people on the dance floor, which again can add complexities. And this to me is a really big piece of why I absolutely love having peer supervision and highly recommend it for all of us who are working in trauma-informed grief ways, because again, we can start to share ways that we're starting to notice ourselves getting onto families' dance floors, and possibly some of that transference, counter-transference is starting to happen from some of our own situations. Again, we want to be very mindful of this because this can be very, we can actually cause a lot of complexities for families. It's interesting to me, we have to be careful, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those 2 styles of grieving, but I come back to kind of the mourners that we may be more drawn to working with. And this becomes a way that we can start to kind of build our own skill sets, but also being more aware of kind of what are we drawn to. So if we're a person who sometimes feels that we lean more into being an instrumental style of griever, do we relate more to the instrumental style of griever in that family center? So therefore, if you're a doer, and that's typically how you start to kind of enter into your own grieving process, do you relate more to the instrumental griever on the dance floor? And maybe the intuitive griever is someone that you're not being able to relate to. So I often say to people, pay attention to who you're drawn to, because you're probably not realizing in some ways that you're drawn to this because of its own familiarity in your own practices as well and in your own personal life. So that's why coming back to integrating this work to me is so critically important. So last week we talked a little bit about the intuitive style of grieving, and I really am not a person who labels, but I often like this as a way to help people understand a little bit. An intuitive style of griever may be somebody who initially goes to emotion first. And so you're processing all of the emotions. People might be noticing those emotions. You might be sad, you might be angry, you might be whatever, discouraged, frustrated, full of joy, versus kind of the person who is more in an instrumental style of grieving, who is the person who gets busy doing things. So if I were to take this analogy back to kind of the early days of the weeks of the mass tragedy that occurred in our community, I think about which style of grieving I entered into first. It was definitely an instrumental. Recognized that I immediately, while I was in lockdown, thinking about all the things that we needed to start doing. And I got really busy. And we started to make videos. We started to figure out how do we get people together. It was just kind of full on. And it was very interesting. I think, you know, as time blurs on us now, but when we got to the time of the virtual memorial service that was held, I think at the end of that first week, I was sitting in my home by myself and I started to watch it online. And it was the moment that they started to show the places that I walk that I started to really feel like, oh my goodness, this has happened in my home. And I really could feel an upsurge of emotion. And people will talk about, I had committed to going on the news after that virtual memorial, and I was very, very shaky. Now, what I go back to, you know, and then people use this language about, oh, is she doing well? Is she not doing well? I think it's important that we really have perpetuated this whole notion of instrumental grievers. For those of us in the helping profession, I think it becomes really easy to step in as a social worker and do the things. So again, what I see, and this is really where I see the Nova Scotia Strong hashtag came out, let's just be instrumental, let's get busy and let's get through this. There is a consequence to that. I think we're all kind of seeing that. I come back to recognizing that first week of that virtual and allowing some of those feelings to show. Then I plowed through and I started to become that instrumental griever again and got busy. And I was doing a call one day and a colleague of mine said, Serena, I've really noticed the last couple of weeks, she said, you're not smiling. And I loved that she, again, did not say this in any judgmental way. It was just an observation. And for those of you who know me, I tend to smile, I tend to laugh, but I tend to cry just as much. So I really loved that observation because it, again, helped me reflect, okay, I haven't been laughing. I actually haven't been crying. It allowed me some space to be able to process this. Now, when we bring this back into a family context, this is so important because we will see such a mixture of intuitive and instrumental styles of grieving. And I think it's really interesting who gets named as the one who's kind of doing the work, helping us get through, and who, and again, we'll start to hear the strong and the weak. We start to hear positive and negative emotions. We start to hear all kinds of things get in the way of family-centered practice. And that's why, to me, these are really important, that, again, there is no style that is better or worse. They really are a natural pendulum swing that we eventually hope that we are going to be able to work with people to kind of allow them to have some opportunity to be active in their life and do the things that are important to them, but also to feel and find their way through this And I know in processing my own trauma, which again is really a big commitment of mine, I will hear the person that supports me saying, I think you're starting to intellectualize that again. And I love that she gently reminds me, okay, I'm back over here in the instrumental. I need to figure out what is my body feeling. And so that's where that somatic work is actually really beautiful, that we can actually allow ourselves, as we're gaining more insight into our own self, we start to pay attention to it more in other people as well. So we can talk more about this intuitive instrumental if you want. If it's very familiar, then I don't want to dwell on it too long for you. So important that, again, we don't always stay in one style. This is a very fluid experience. It depends on who we have around us. It depends on kind of our past traumas and what might get evoked. So again, but what I do see in our society is that we tend to perpetuate and reinforce this sense of being strong, which really was frightening to me to see a hashtag get out there that we really, you know, if we just keep plowing through. One of the research papers that I draw upon again from the Swiss Air context from Terry Mitchell, she asked one very powerful question. She wants to know, after a major disaster, community silence, low help-seeking behaviors, and limited disaster health responses raises a critical question. Is this a profile of resilience or a community silently enduring? And that, to me, when you look at a community and a family-centered practice, we have to be really cognizant of kind of just thinking that this quietness and not allowing spaces for the intuition and the intuitive aspects of grieving to be present. We leave people very much abandoned in this. Now, moving ahead into family-centered practice sometimes brings up a lot of doubt and fear for us as practitioners, and I understand that. Again, because we don't know, and people will often say, do we really want to open Pandora's box? And I think it's important that as we're working with families, that they are the ones that are opening the box as gently and as easily, or maybe not so gently, in a way. Again, I think, again, I reinforce the fact that people are doing the best they can with what they have in the moment. And I remember stopping with a meal. I was working at a community get together, and I was asked to drop a meal off at a community, and I didn't know the people who lived at the home. And when I knocked on the door, a person came to the door and said, quickly, they said, I know who you are. And I said, okay. And they said, I remember you from being on TV. And I internally always cringe when I hear that, because I never know whether people have felt any of the messages to be supportive, or whether it has felt very not supportive to them. So I was not quite sure what they were going to say. And then the person started to cry and said, you know, my family is struggling, and really struggling, and started to share the connections that they had to the mass event. And it was so powerful just in that one moment that I was doubtful knocking on the door. I was fearful when they acknowledged that they knew who I was, but yet we had this beautiful connection in these moments of kind of, what is it that your family needs right now? I see you as a mom who is very much hurting and really not sure how to help support your children. What can we do? And so I think there's always that moment of not feeling equipped enough. I respect that. I think that this is hard work. But I think, again, those doubts and fears and that kind of clinical supervision, that background stuff that we do together, I think helps to support us moving in to help support families. So our thoughts and our feelings, again, I often say that sometimes we're going to hear our grief and trauma stories coming through our thoughts. Those of us who kind of intellectualize and kind of want to kind of figure things out in their heads. Some people are going to enter into it with their feelings first. And some people are going to show us through their behaviors. And I think for all of you that are on this call from school settings, we recognize that sometimes people are showing us their reality through their behaviors. And sometimes we have to listen not to what they're saying, but what they're not saying. And how do we help support them? how do we help kind of open up the space to be more trauma informed and kind of more courageous to be able to talk about losses and what it is that people are experiencing. So it's always important, no matter what your way of entering into talking about reality or showing or demonstrating reality is not everybody else's. One of the things, and I think about you, Tracy, if you're still on the call, I always think it's so impactful as we're doing group work. And I've often said to a lot of our students, a lot of adults that I've worked with, I really don't think the grief is going to kill you, but what I am concerned is that the guilt's going to do a job. And so we have an opportunity to talk about the things that people carry. And oftentimes, you know, I often say in long-term care, when people talk about a difficult family, and I said, you know, have you asked the family kind of what their processing is? They've dropped off their loved one at the door. And if we could understand guilt as it connects, and guilt and shame as it connects to being trauma informed, I think we have a better idea of understanding that people have been carrying a lot. And therefore, we start to have a different kind of dialogue, and we bring the guilt, we bring the shame to the light in gentle ways. Some things that I want to just remind people of very quickly from a communication lens. We'll kind of wrap up. I see a lot of people are starting to get off the call now. I have a few more slides. We'll keep going.
No, don't worry though, because we are recording. So if you all haven't made our YouTube channel your favorite, I invite you to do that. And also a reminder, we are transforming education into advocacy in March. So stay connected to us, please. And yeah, I see people saying we're still here, so don't rush.
Thank you. Again, just a few communication from a family-centered lens that I always try to remind people. Whenever we're using the word should, and I have a colleague of mine I always refer to, she always says, I will not should on myself today, and I will not should on you. And I think when we start to hear the shoulds come up, and even in a family context of meetings about how someone should be behaving, how someone should be doing this, I think it's so important that we're pulling back, because this is really the breeding ground for guilt and shame. So when I should on you, I'm telling you my way of doing things. And I think that can be really harmful.
One question that has come up that's also related to this, and so I'm going to just name it, and I'm sure you can maybe weave it into what you were going to do. So you're speaking about preparing individuals, families, and communities to be more resilient for anticipatory grief, so they have skills to cope in the future. The more practicing I do, both professional and personal, I'm developing a conflicting relationship with the idea of resilience, which is what you've also been talking about. For example, as a young queer person who works with other queer people, I find myself struggling with the idea of promoting resilience in response to the harms and anti-queer, transphobic, homophobic violence in my community experiences. More often than not, it feels like being taught to be resilient is a requisite for being queer. That repeated violence and mass shootings in our safer spaces from external forces will always be an expectation. What are your thoughts on this? And do you have any tips on how to approach discussions with community on resilience in this context?
I applaud that comment, and I thank the person who has put this out there. Thank you so much. I have the exact same visceral reaction to resilience when resilience is something that I am trying to put on someone else. I think it's another way that we're trying to promote stoicism and silence, and I have a huge reaction to that. Where I think about resilience, and I think about the root system of a tree and the stuff that we don't show people, I really believe, and I think of last week, you might have noticed that I had one of Michelle Obama's quotes, that grief and resilience live together. And I think they very much live together. And I think we have to be able to name the losses, name the trauma. And that really, the resilience to me is the stuff that we create ourselves. And that does not look like what anybody else. So I think it's the sharing of whatever parts of our story, but it's breaking down the silence. So I have a very adverse reaction, and I hope in no way you feel like I'm promoting that whole idea of getting resilience on other people, because I actually find that very counterintuitive and harmful. And And I noticed that people were doing that with us constantly. If I had to listen to one more or get dragged into another interview on how resilient our communities were, and it infuriated me. We're not resilient. We're actually being brought to our knees. And I applaud you. There's so many different communities and populations who have been silenced and being able to tell their stories. I have recently started reading so many memoirs that I really, and I always take time to sit and write to the authors about how impactful their voices are to break this code of silence that I think is really holding so much of us back. So I appreciate and I thank you for that, because in no way, resilience to me is that I see it as a word that, again, it's almost like the empowerment word that in the 90s that I struggled with, because I felt like that we were kind of trying to superimpose empowerment on other people, which infuriated me just as much. That really isn't up to me to empower someone else. I think, again, is, do I provide an environment that feels safe enough for people to be able to explore parts of their stories that they get to, again, and we're going to draw on some of the narrative therapies. What does this mean to me? And I pull in some of the existential therapies as well. I mean, how do I make meaning for myself? How do I find ways to live and coexist, but recognizing my story is so much my own story, but it's very much connected to those macro lens. So I'd love to come back. Rebecca, if you're on, can you please save that question? Because I really love to come back to that. And I'd love to hear what other people, I just applaud that you actually put that very impactful question out there, because resilience to me sometimes, it makes me want to vomit what we've done to it. So giving advice, pushing or pulling someone, reinforcing stages and language of grief, the stigmas. And again, I think if we're not being really aware of our biases and their impacts, and I think if we use resilience right there, if I'm putting resilience on someone, what am I doing that's impacting and harming their own process of healing? So these are some things that I'm often saying to people from a communication lens to be very cognizant of. The pushing and pulling, people don't think they're doing that, but in their language, I can quickly see. I mean, I've had so many people say, is there any chance that you could work with my mom? Because I would really like her to come out of her funk. And I'm like, well, that sounds to me like you're trying to pull your mom. And I don't know about you, but I really don't enjoy people doing that to me. So when I talk about grieving, it's that pendulum between an intuitive and an instrumental. I think it's a very slow moving movement that we're helping to support people, that they're finding their own flow back and forth from that. So we'll talk a bit more about that one as well next week. Thank you for the, thank you. I'm going to Queer and Transgender Resilience by Annalise Singh. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Now, some of the things that I think are really important when we're looking at family-centered practice, active listening. And active listening, I was doing some professional development thinking I was a pretty good listener until I went into doing this professional development. And I realized I wish in our helping professions that we had opportunity for professional development to continue to do some of the foundational pieces of our work. Because active listening to me means that there's a message with fact and feeling. And I think they're so important that even the questions that we're asking sometimes are leading people out of what they wanted to tell us. So those foundational pieces of our practices to me really, that's why having peer supervision, having opportunities to come together, allow us to keep practicing in very safe ways, deepening our practices, which when we're working in trauma-informed and grief work, I think they're very impactful. What will open up a story for someone versus what closes the story for someone. Being aware of your own biases and beliefs and how they get revealed. And they don't only get revealed through our verbals, but they also get very much revealed through our nonverbals, the things that we don't talk about. Allowing space for true resiliency. And what I mean here is the paradox of the sadness and the joy. So we can't just kind of go to the joy and tell me how you overcome this. I need to know what has brought you to your knees over this. I don't need to know it. if you care to share that with me. But I think that paradox is so important for what I define as resiliency, not the stuff that we're getting on people. Seeing strengths, not just the limitations. That's why I often will take families back to really, can you tell me another time that you've gone through a hardship within your family? And what was that like for you? What did you notice? Where did you get divided? Where did you come together? And how, what can we use from that? Were there opportunities of growth that you see? And I always believe that there's capacity for growth in this work. And I know that it's hard. I know there were many days that as I was walking on my pathway of my walk, I wasn't sure that we were going to find growth. And I don't think time heals it. I really know that time doesn't heal it. I think it's really the hard work that we do. And again, that brings me back to that intuitive and instrumental. So it's not about kind of getting over it, getting around it, or getting under it. This is hard work of going through. And to me, the connections that we have with people who we may define as family, be that friends, be that colleagues, be that peer supports, be that counselors that we need to kind of unpack pieces of this. The growth is an important part of this work. So again, I just bring in a few more tools around that whole idea. And there's so many of these that we could draw upon, that some, to realize, recognize, respond, and resist. Some colleagues that a lovely person I worked with many, many years ago would often dig right in really quickly and want to know people's trauma stories. And I'm like, oh my. So we know that we're really evolving. And I think it's important that this becomes part of our professional development, and kind of how do we continue to keep learning, growing, and evolving, knowing that we can keep working this in a way that we're becoming more community and family centered, as well as individually centered. So I'm often saying that if we think about reframing grief and trauma, I think it gives us an opportunity to think creatively. And I'm really so impacted by the variety of ways that people, I think about songs that move me. I think about movies that I watch with the theme of grief and trauma. I think many people have demonstrated to us memoirs, journal articles that we're reading that have some participatory research where stories are being shared. And I think there's so many creative ways, again, from a community and family lens, but again, it's kind of who has the power, who's in control. Those are important things. Supporting connections, seeing the possibilities of kind of how do we come through this and how do we teach and learn and support and grow together. Being more proactive, I guess, to me would help us be less reactive. I think about us continuing to talk about a mental health crisis, and I keep thinking, at what point will we become much more proactive to see that grief awareness, grief literacy, grief responsiveness, and again, the same for trauma, allows us to not allow this to manifest into ways that create illness, and again, to pathologize all of this. So it allows a new way of doing things, which is what I think about how impacted I was during, and I listened to other people. I think it's so important that we continue to expand our theoretical context in the way that we work with people. I was thinking about the impact after the mass casualty, and I use again that example because again, it's very real in kind of my own lived experience, as you all have all of yours. But I was so affected by, again, with good intentions, that we would suggest to people that some of the cognitive behavior therapies of distracting ourselves actually started to feel incredibly offensive. And, this isn't so much about trying to distract ourselves through this, it's trying to wade our way through something that was big and shook us. And there's so many multiple ways of knowing, but kind of reinforcing one way of the way that we do it, I think can really create much more silence, much more harm, and sometimes create more vicarious trauma that we're not being seen, we're not being heard, we're not being valued, we're not being believed, we're not really allowing our own true senses of understanding in our own families and our own lived experience of what our own story of this is. And that is where, with Brene Brown, I think about this. If we deny the story, then it defines us. When we own the story, we can write a brave new beginning. And I know writing has become an incredibly important part of my healing, really thinking about this is my story, and you each have a story. And I think every person that we're working with has a story, and those stories interconnect with their families, they interconnect with their communities. We don't write our stories in isolation. But I think, again, do our families and our communities, I think, again, we have that ability. Is it more from beauty or is it more from pain? And I was in a memoir writing course a couple of weeks ago, and somebody was saying, like, how do you write a story about your life that has other people in it? And the person said, well, if they wanted you to write about them in a more positive light, then they would have treated you in a more positive light. And I thought, well, that's an interesting answer. So, but it is so true, right? Our stories interconnect with others, and that is part of our lived experience as human beings. That is part of us living in a social way with one another. Recently reading Braided Sweetgrass, I think again about the quote here, all powers have two sides, the power to create and the power to destroy. And we must recognize them both, but if we invest our gifts on the side of creation, and I thought that was such a powerful quote. Again, it doesn't dismiss, it doesn't throw resiliency into this. It's really looking at the dichotomy of both of these issues that are happening here, and really kind of how are we growing, and how are we kind of, again, looking at the 7 generations ahead of us. And again, what power do we use now to kind of help move away from these powers that are destroying us? So I thought that quote was very profound in all of this. So I come back again to summarize. Again, let's move beyond sending our thoughts and prayers and continue to reinforce the need for policy and change. I hope today felt like a little bit of an exploration. I can't thank you enough for your participation and your engagement in this, as we kind of did a bit of a review of what family-centered and community-centered practice, how it influences the work that we're doing together. So I don't know if anyone has any other comments or thoughts or questions that we can open up some space for.
Yeah, so there was a question about our YouTube channel. Things are not uploaded just yet, but hopefully they will be soon. So thank you for your patience with us. We're also juggling our registration and renewals and all of the questions that you all are sending us. There's some beautiful conversations in the webinar. So for those of you that are watching us on YouTube, being able to participate live allows some really brilliant, wonderful sharing of ideas and reflections on what gives us energy to keep doing that work. I think that's roughly it. You had said you wanted to go back to the question about queer resilience. There was a book that I also shared in the chat. Lots of people are expressing gratitude right now as well.
And I would express it right back. Thank you for participating in this and sharing the aspects that you have. I really appreciated this. I wish we were all in a room together. I always think that, but so next week we'll move into the third aspect of kind of how we establish this. And again, we know that these conversations need to continue on, but I just appreciate that we've been able to collectively come together to do some exploring. I do reiterate how important it is that all of you have an opportunity to kind of do something as a transition for yourself. A cup of tea, some walk outside, whatever that might be for you, just recognizing that we all too carry our own lived experiences of family and community, both with some beauty, both with some pain, or maybe one more than the other. So just tending to our own souls and our own soul wounds, I think, is an incredibly important piece of us being humans in this.
Thank you. Yes. And I do want to just remind people that we are going to be having our advocacy day in March. And one of the things that Serena talked about beautifully is the ways in which sometimes cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can be used in ways that are harmful to shut down processing and can amplify guilt and shame as a result. And right now, CBT is the primary mode of counseling that is being offered in lots of settings. And so really important that we join together to advocate for alternative approaches to counseling and support. Yes, very appreciative for all of these conversations that we're having. Lots of gratitude to everyone. Serena, hopefully you were drinking in some of the applause and hearts that were being shared as well. So grateful to you, so grateful to Kristen and to all of the people who helped make today possible. And I'm so grateful that we get to continue learning next week as well. So it's the same link that you used today for next week. And we look forward to having you all. And again, thank you so much. Any other last questions? I don't see any, just a lot of gratitude. So we'll end on a note of gratitude and look forward to more healing and wisdom next week. All right, so that's 15 minutes for self-care, everyone.